effective tools for mental illnesses that are psychodrugs. Psychodrugs are drugs that modify the functioning for neurotransmitter, in particular dopamine, serotonin, and so on. And so the vision of mental health for psychiatrists is that the focus of the problem is the brain. So if you want to improve mental health, we have to correct the functioning of the brain. However, we don't have any specific area of the brain that is clearly connected to a specific mental health illness. So the problem is, yes, psychodrugs they work a lot, but at the same time, they do not provide a final solution to mental health disease. On the other side, you have a very different vision. Oh, I don't know why it doesn't work. Probably there was, okay. Okay. The second vision is totally different, is the vision of clinical psychology. For clinical psychology, mental health is not only inside our brain, but also from outside. Our life experiences generate memories, generates emotion, generating feelings that can in some way produce mental health illnesses. So the idea of psychotherapy is that if you want to understand how to cope with mental disease, you have to cope with experiences, with the life experience of the person. You have trauma, you have problems, and understanding, coping with that traumas, that problems, you can solve the vision. So we have two different visions. The biological one that says that the brain is the problem, and the psychological one that say that the experience is the problem. A negative experience is what makes you unhealthy. Even if both sides are true, both psychotherapy and psychodrugs work in some way, they are not the final solution. So the big challenge now for mental health is trying to put together these two visions. And a few years ago, Nature, one of the leading scientific journals, suggested that we need new solution for putting together these two visions, because most of the tools we use in mental health are not so different from the tools used a lot of years ago. Even if in medicine, technology has a big impact, in psychology, the impact of technology is much lower. So what I suggested answering to this paper is that we can find in technologies, a tool for putting together these two visions of the mental health problem. So through technology, we can put together the brain and the outside world. How? Well, the idea is that using technologies, and in particular virtual reality technologies, simulative technologies, we can improve the quality of life people and solve mental health disease for better. But to understand why technology can be helpful, we have to understand some more about the process of change. We know that process of change is critical for mental health, but understanding how change works is not easy. What is change? This is not an easy question, because we know that change occurs when we focus on an experience. So experience is the starting point of any change. If you want to change, we have to focus on some characteristic of a specific experience. And according to the different vision, because in psychotherapy we have many different visions about the process of change, we can focus on a specific element of the experience, and we try to modify it. So the basic vision provided by psychology related to change is that change happens when you focus on a specific experience or a feature of that experience and you try to modify it. The big problem in clinical psychology is that you have many different approaches. So many starting point for the process of change. If you have psychoanalysis says that you have to focus on insights, you have to focus on inner concepts. If you understand instead the approach of cognitive behavioral therapy, you have to modify cognition and behavior. So the big issue is that we know that we have to start from experience, but what to choose for starting depends on the clinical vision you have. However, to find a path in between these different visions, two colleagues, Safran and Greenberg, suggested that even if change can happen in many different ways, the process of change is always the same. And this process can be summarized in two ways: top-down change and bottom-up change. What is the difference? The difference is the starting point. In bottom-up change, you start from low-level perception or emotions. So the idea is that by changing low-level perception and emotion, you then modify behavior and then you modify cognition. Or you have a different approach that is called top-down. In top-down, the path is the opposite. You move from cognition, you try to modify cognition, modifying cognition modifies behavior, and then you also modify emotions. So for a cognitive psychologist like me, was very interesting to understand why we can change in two different ways. And the answer comes from the work of a well-known psychology, Professor Daniel Kahneman. Professor Daniel Kahneman got a Nobel Prize for economics because he demonstrated that our brain is split in two. We have two different brains in our mind. We have one brain that is called intuition. Kahneman describes it as system one. Intuition generates impressions. So the idea is that through intuition, we get impressions about the world and the person around us. And then we have another system, system two, that is based on reasoning. The difference is that if system one generates impression, system two generates reasoning. What are the differences between these two brain systems? Well, while if intuition is fast, based on perception, is parallel, so you can have many different parallel processes at the same time, and is effortless. You don't need specific cognitive resources in order to handle with intuition. Instead, reasoning is the opposite. Reasoning cannot work in parallel, so you have a single item at once. It is effortless. It requires you a lot of effort in order to achieve what you want, and it's slow. Reasoning requires a lot of cognitive resources, so the processes are quite longer. And this difference between reasoning and intuition is quite clear in the difference between knowledge, verbal knowledge, and task performance. You may know very well what to do, but you may be not able to do so. For instance, when you study for a driving license, you may be fully aware of the process of driving, but when you go to the exam, they fire you because you were not able to achieve what you wanted to do. So the idea is that the big challenge for change is, if you want people to change, these people has to change at both levels. You have to modify intuition and reasoning at the same time. And this is a difficult part, because most of the process of change are more focused on a specific brain area. For instance, many times, a lot of process of change are focused on the reasoning. They try to explain you why you should change. You want to stop smoking? Well, if you smoke so much, you will have a cancer. Reasoning. But reasoning enough is not enough to provide you a final change. If you want to change really, you have to modify intuition, because smoking is not only a rational process, it's also an intuitive one. You have the feeling of smoking, you have the movement of the hands when you smoke, and all these features are intuitive, and if you don't change them, you will not stop smoking. And the interesting thing is that the most effective way for changing both intuition and reasoning is through simulative technology. In particular, virtual reality is able to target both sides. Through virtual reality, you can modify both intuition and reasoning. And it works. We know that it works. There are many different meta-analysis, systematic review that show how virtual reality can produce long-term change in very complex pathologies, such as anxiety disorder, such as pain management, and even eating and weight disorder. So the idea is that virtual reality and augmented reality are effective clinical tools because they are able to target at the same time both intuition and reasoning. And this is the biggest difference with other technologies, such as the web, that typically is able to target only the reasoning part. And how virtual reality can be used? The most used approach, clinical approach related to virtual reality, is using virtual reality for coping with anxiety disorders. How virtual reality is used? Well, you know that anxiety disorders are based on the ability of our brain of predicting a fear. So if I have a fear of flight, even the idea of entering a plane can produce me a very strong fear. The best way to cope with a phobia like fear of flight is through the experience, because the more we experience something, the less is the emotional response we receive. So the first time we eat a good cake, we appreciate it a lot. After 100 times we eat the same cake, well, the level of pleasure is much lower. So the best approach is exposing the subject to the fearful situation. Obviously, no one wanted to be exposed to fearful situation. So the good thing of virtual reality is that you can create exposure situations that are totally controlled. Well, I can, if I have fear of flight, I can enter in the plane and the plane will stand still, will not move at all, or the plane can be empty. I can simulate any feature of the experience, and I will do takeoff and landing only when the subject has the ability of controlling this kind of situation. So the idea of exposure, providing an experience as a way to modifying our intuitive fears. And we know that it works. We know from a lot of works that phobias can be easily treated using this approach. So virtual reality now is one of the most effective way for coping with an intuitive response like the one produced by fear. And yes, you can do also in reality. The idea is that you can use also reality to do the same. You can take a person on a plane, but controlling a plane yourself is much more difficult and is not practical for a therapist. You cannot follow the patient on a plane, and you cannot arrange a flight for a specific patient. Virtual reality, you can do that. You can arrange any specific feature of the experience in order to target the skill of the patient. And why virtual reality is so effective? Well, there are two features of virtual reality that can explain the power of this technology for clinical check. The first one, as I told you, is that virtual reality is an experiential technology, provides experiences. But also more interesting for me as a neuropsychology, a cognitive psychology, is that virtual reality is a cognitive technology in the sense that virtual reality works like our brain. And this is a recent discovery that provides a lot of insights about the potential of this technology. I want to be more clear. Let's focus on the neuroscience of virtual reality, because understanding the neuroscience of virtual reality is quite important for understanding why virtual reality is now a very powerful tool for mental health. Well, I don't know if you are familiar with cognitive psychology. The basic idea behind cognitive psychology, starting 20, 30 years ago, is that perception was an objective fact. When I started to study cognitive psychology for my bachelor degree, the idea of many textbooks at that time was that perception was objective. So we have something from outside, signals, bodies. These signal bodies arrive to our senses. These senses are in some way touched by external signals, and we perceive these external signals. Well, this vision, this objective vision of the brain now is challenged a lot by recent discoveries of neuroscience. In particular, we know that it's not true. Our brain is not objective, but is instead more similar to a simulator. The basic idea suggested by cognitive science now is that virtual reality is like our brain, because our brain is in fact a very sophisticated simulator. The idea is that our brain tries to predict in advance what is happening to us. So perception, even perception, is not totally objective, because perception, it depends on what you want to do, and it depends on your expectations. And how this is possible? This is possible because our brain, as suggested by this new vision of embodied cognition now is the emerging trend in cognitive neuroscience. The idea is that our brain is based on a motor code. So we code any experience according to the movement of our bodies, and this motor code is used for doing prediction. I try to clarify this point because it's not so easy. We know that in our brain we have canonical neurons. These canonical neurons have a very specific feature. Their feature is the ability of being activated not only when we do something, but when we have something outside that can be the that can do the same thing. For instance, mirror neurons, you look at me, if you look at me, your neurons activated and copy the movement I'm doing. So you can understand my movements because you, in your brain, the brain is simulating inside the same movement I'm doing. So you can understand my movement and giving them a meaning. And the same for canonical neurons. Canonical neurons are even more interesting. They provide you a simulation when you see a tool, an artifact that provides you some affordances. So the idea is that I have my crutch here. Well, my brain just looking at it is able to simulate how I can use that before I move my hand. And this ability is now described by this emerging trend in neuroscience that is called predictive coding. The idea behind predictive coding that is a mathematical model, because we can express all these features using maths. So we have a mathematical model that explains how our brain can simulate everything. The basic idea of predictive coding is that in our brain, we have two different simulations, one related to external world and the other one related to our own body. And these two simulations interacts and provide us a vision of the world that is not fully objective, in the sense that is modified by our own brain. And why the brain is using this approach? The basic idea is that if we can predict in advance what will happen to us, we will be able to cope with unexpected event as much as possible. So the idea is that by doing prediction, we can survive better in a complex environment. If we can predict what is happening to us, we can find a solution and coping unexpected situation. So the idea is that this predicting coding approach is able to reduce the level of errors. We can do better prediction, and the better prediction can help us to avoid problems. The interesting thing is that this approach, predictive coding, is the same one now used by artificial intelligence. So artificial intelligence has cloned the predictive coding approach, and the basic mathematical mechanism suggested by this approach are now used by artificial intelligence. So the advances in artificial intelligence were possible because of the application of the basic principles behind this vision of predictive coding. An interesting example research that suggests the power of our brain in modifying reality is this well-known experiment that is called the gorilla effect. Probably some of you was already familiar with this experiment. The experiment is quite simple. A group of students were asked to look at the first image. You see this one. In this first image, you have a group of basketball players, and the goal that was asked to the subjects was to count how many times the players wearing a white t-shirts were passing the ball. So their attention was focused on player wearing white t-shirt. During the basketball experience, a gorilla passes through the scene. You see, a huge gorilla is not a small one, but only a small percentage of students involved in the task noticed that, because their attention were focused on the white t-shirts player, and no one noticed the black gorilla entering in the scene. This effect is called cognitive blindness. So you may lose the focus of your attention because you are not interested to what is happening. So even if it's happening in front of you, you are not able to notice what is happening because your brain is not interested in that. The mechanism of cognitive blindness suggests that our brain makes a lot of effort to do prediction and to check the prediction. And when you do a prediction, well, this prediction may push you to lose something. And the effect of cognitive blindness suggests the power of this approach. So the basic idea of the functioning of the brain is quite simple. The idea is before doing an action, before taking the bottle of water, my brain simulates in advance the movement I have to do. Then perception checks if I am doing this kind of movement. If the movement corresponds to the prediction, I am present in the movement and all is okay. Instead, if the prediction is wrong, because between me and the bottle there is some wood protection, so I cannot reach immediately the bottle, well, my brain shifts to reasoning to find a solution. This mechanism is very powerful in the sense that it allows the brain to reduce the number of mistakes, but also has a lot of issues. I try to explain this project. Why virtual reality is important? Because virtual reality works in the same way. The basic idea behind virtual reality work is that virtual reality tries to predict the sensory consequences of the movements of the subjects like our brain. And the more the prediction is similar to the one of the brain, the more the subjects feels present inside virtual reality. So the idea is that virtual reality is based on prediction. Our brain is based on prediction, so the more the prediction of virtual reality is similar to the one of our brain, the more we'll feel present inside virtual reality. So what is presence in virtual reality is the ability of the technology of simulating the functioning of our brain. And this, in my opinion, is quite important because it can explain why virtual reality is so effective. And in this sense, virtual reality, the feeling of telepresence is the ability of the technology of simulating the predictive mechanism of our brain. As I told before, virtual reality works if it is able to predict the same brain mechanism used for simulating reality. This is quite important, and also is important because through this approach, virtual reality has been used, well, no problem. Using this approach, virtual reality has been used a lot in the field of rehabilitation. We know that cognitive rehabilitation, thank you. Cognitive rehabilitation is an emerging area of research because with a longer life, elderly may experience a lot of long-term disease. We know that degenerative diseases are now increasing a lot. And through the ability of virtual reality of simulating basic cognitive mechanism, now virtual reality has been used to improve and correct cognitive deficits. It's not the topic of my talk now. I don't want to deep inside this, even if there is a lot of studies, because I will discuss some of them tomorrow. But the basic idea is that through virtual reality, you can increase functional recovery by simulating the basic mechanism of the brain. But today, I will focus on the fact that we have a lot of studies supporting this vision. So if you want to explore how virtual reality has been used in cognitive rehabilitation, this systematic review provides a clear summary of the main research in this area. So virtual reality is a very effective tool to cope with cognitive deficits. But this vision of predicting coding, the idea that our brain is a simulative processor, in the last year has moved also to high-level cognitive process. So at first, researchers considered this approach working only for perception. Now, they suggest that simulation are also used by the brain for high-level processes such as the self and such as the experience of the body. So both the experience of the body and the experience of the self, key features of our experience, of core experience as humans, are probably based on these simulative mechanisms. And the interesting thing is that prediction can fail. We know that in many pathologies, the predictive brain fails. And when it fails, individuals experience mental illnesses. And now very complex pathologies such as schizophrenia or autism that are quite difficult to treat have a clear link with the simulative mind. So the idea is that in these patients, the simulative mind is not working as it should be. And so to summarize at this point what I want to pass to you, our brain is a simulator, and this simulation usually works quite well, and we don't be aware about it. However, in some situations, and some of these situations are mental illnesses, this simulative mechanism doesn't work so well. So an approach for coping with the difference between biological psychiatry and psychotherapy is considering mental illnesses such as a problem of the simulation. Why this approach is interesting? Because on one side, it suggests that the simulation are run inside our brain. So like biological psychiatry, it says that the brain is a part of the process, but also prediction are based on what is happening outside our brain. So the content of the prediction are always the outcome of an experience. In this way, we can connect these two visions. And this is opening a new clinical approach. This new clinical approach is now called clinical computational neuroscience. Clinical computational neuroscience is based on the functioning of the brain, in the sense that the prediction are made through the working of neurons in our brain. But at the same time, the mental illness is related to how our brain makes prediction. So the goal of this new field, the clinical computational neuroscience, is to provide a new vision for mental health problems and provide new tools for correcting them. How we can correct a wrong simulation? This is the key question that is addressed by clinical computational neuroscience. Well, this is the math part. I don't want to bother you with maths, but the basic idea is that the best way to correct a wrong prediction is through the experience of events that our brain is not able to predict. Yesterday, Andrea Gaggioli spoke about the concept of transformative experiences. Transformative experiences are experiences that our brain is not able to predict in advance. The big problem is that creating experiences that you are not able to predict in advance is quite difficult in the real life. In fact, transformative experiences are not so much. We don't have so many transformative experiences in our life. And this is why technology can help a lot. In particular, we know that through the use of transformative experience, you can modify the functioning of the brain. This is a quite interesting study that I want to share with you. This is a study made by our colleague Hunter Hoffman from the University of Washington. Hunter Hoffman was working with patients that suffered a huge burn on the body. When you have a burning of your body, your skin is not available anymore, and the risk of infection is very high. So you have to bend the full body every 2 hours in order to avoid the risk of an illness. The big issue is that when you remove bands, you experience a very painful experience. And this pain is so strong that even opioids are not able to cope with that. To solve this problem, these psychologists decided to use virtual reality. You see in the small picture below. So in the small picture, the guy that received a significant burn on the body experienced virtual reality in order to cope with the pain of the removal of the bands. Well, what happened? It happens that the patient did not experience the pain. When this colleague published this paper, no one in the medical community believed in that. They said it's impossible. Why this guy is not able to experience pain? And probably they said, physicians said, it's a problem of distraction. So he replicated the study by comparing immersive virtual reality with a Nintendo video game. And he discovered that when you play Nintendo, well, you feel pain. In virtual reality, no pain. Again, the medical community didn't believe in that. So after many efforts, he developed an helmet, a virtual reality helmet that was able to enter in fMRI, because you know that in fMRI, you cannot use technology providing magnetic fields. So he developed a new helmet in order to have this experience inside fMRI. And you see the scans. The scans are here. You see very well that in the higher scan, no virtual reality, all the brain areas related to pain were clearly visible. In virtual reality, you see the activation of the brain areas related to pain were not active. Why? What happened in virtual reality that make it possible? Well, the strategy that this colleague used was to dissolve the body in virtual reality. So inside virtual reality, the user didn't see anymore the body. It was just a couple of eyes. It was an experience unexpected before. And the basic concept is that being just a couple of eyes, no more body for experience pain. The pain is always in a body. But if you don't have a body, you don't feel the pain. In other words, the use of virtual reality was able to hack the mechanism, the simulative mechanism of the brain, cheating it and making it experience the lack of body. That is something that you cannot achieve in real life. This mechanism is very powerful, and so recently we have used the same approach, a simplified version of this approach that is called body swapping. One of the most strange experience you can have in virtual reality is the experience of a different body. So what happens to you that have a male or female body when you enter in the body of different gender? It's totally new. It's something you cannot predict. And now with virtual reality, you can do it easily. This is how it works, the process.
Person is invited to wear a head-mounted display connected to a computer in order to embody into a virtual body. On the virtual body, red points disappear as soon as the razor reader and motion tracking device touch them in order to calibrate the virtual body according to the real one. Touching the actual belly of participants is mimicked in the R either synchronously or asynchronously. The former allows participants for a deeper sense of immersion and involvement so that they can experience the virtual body as if it was a real body.
So the mechanism is quite simple. You touch your real body in sync with the virtual one. And after looking at this process for 10 minutes, your brain thinks that the real body is the one you see in virtual reality, not the one that has been touched by you. This is the mechanism. And it is very powerful. And we used a lot in the field of eating disorder, anorexia nervosa. You know, anorexia nervosa is a common eating disorder problem in which you feel so fat, even if your body is very thin. In this case, it's clear that there is a problem in the simulation in our brain. So what we have done was to use this body illusion to modify the experience of the body of the anorectic girl. And what we found was that just one session of the body illusion was able to significantly improve the level of distortion. So if before virtual reality, the anorectic girls experienced the body significantly larger, so they experienced a body that was almost the double of the real life. After this approach, we were able to significantly reduce body distortion, and this happened in many studies. So in many studies we have done with anorectic patients, body illusions were able to reduce the level of distortion of the patients. And we can do more now. Up to now, virtual reality has been used to simulate external reality. So with virtual reality, you can simulate external body. But what my team is doing is trying also to simulate the internal reality. So the idea is that we want to simulate also the internal signals of the body. And in particular, we have developed a new clinical approach that's called sonoception. And sonoception is able to use sound and vibration to simulate our internal signals. In particular, we are working on an interoceptive simulator. This is the device that we have developed that is able to modify your heart signals, in particular heart rate and heart rate variability, without any external effort from the side of the individual. So the basic idea is that now through virtual reality and through sonoception, so the use of simulator of interoceptive signals, you can modify the full body experience of the individual. Obviously, this is a new research area, so we don't have so many clinical studies, but The first study we published with the patients was related to chronic pain. You know that chronic pain is a significant problem. Again, chronic pain is a problem of simulation. You had a pain in the past, and this experience of the pain is still linked to your own experience, even if the physical source of the pain has disappeared. So what we have done was to use this approach to reduce the level of chronic pain. And using just a session, we were able to significantly reduce the level of pain. So by generating a simulation of the internal signals. Obviously, this is an emerging area, so I can provide just some starting point for what we want to do, but our goal in the future is working on this concept of regenerative virtual therapy. So the idea behind the regenerative virtual therapy is that we use the ability of our body to modify itself through simulation for modifying wrong simulation that can be the sources of mental illnesses. We are working on a complex model that is summarized in this picture. So we try to put together different pieces of treatment. On one side, we will focus on attention. So the starting point will be a simplified form of mindfulness, because we know that mindfulness can be very useful to reduce the impact of previous negative simulations. Then we will use full body illusion in virtual reality that will use both simulation of the external body through body swapping and of the internal body through interoceptive simulation. And then we use cognitive reappraisal, that is a very common strategy used by cognitive behavioral therapy that will try to connect the modified experience to the autobiographical memory of the individual. It's a novel approach. We are working on it in our lab, and yes, we hope to find clinical data very soon to support this approach. If you are interested on this vision, in these papers, we can find the summary of the key concept I presented today. Thank you in advance for your attention.